Hello everyone, I am Anshul Khanna teaching at Sri Chaitanya Vijayawada Goshala. Today we will be doing the chapter of gravitation. It's a scoring chapter, easy chapter. Many things that we will do here are very common with electrostatics. So without wasting a single moment, let's get started. First of all, in gravitation we will learn about Kepler's 3 laws of planetary motion. The first law, all planets move in elliptical orbit about the sun with sun at a focus. So, before Kepler gave this law, people believed that planets move in circular orbit. Kepler specified that the planets must be moving in an elliptical orbit. Now see, this is the elliptical orbit. An ellipse has got 2 focus. At one of the focus we have sun. What do we have on the other focus? Nothing. Before we move on, we should understand the properties of ellipse. So, what is an ellipse? The locus of a point which moves in such a way that the sum of its distance from 2 fixed points remains constant. So think of fixed point 1, fixed point 2, and a particle which moves in such a way that no matter where the particle is, the sum of its distance from first point plus second point, that remains constant. So how to draw an ellipse? Take a cardboard sheet. On that cardboard sheet, take 2 thumbnails and place 2 pins. Now connect these 2 pins with a string, a soft wire or string. Now, with the help of a marker, let's say these are 2 fixed pins and there is a string connected between. With the help of a marker or pen, make the string tight. Okay, so here you have got marker. Now, keeping the string tight, move the marker. The type of shape that you will get, that is an ellipse. How do you know that this is an ellipse? Let's say beta, initially at this point, the distance from first fixed point is x1, the distance from second fixed point is y1. What is x1 plus y1? x1 plus y1 is nothing but the length of this string. When you move the marker, keeping the string tight, let's say you have reached this point. At this point, the distance from, let's say, first fixed point is x2. The distance from second fixed point is y2. Again, you will say x2 plus y2 is nothing but the length of the string. So, on this whole curve, no matter where you go, the sum of distance from the 2 fixed point equals to the length of the string. So, we can say that x1 plus y1, the sum of distance from 2 fixed point equals to x2 plus y2, because for an ellipse that remains constant. Remember that these 2 fixed points are the 2 foci of the ellipse. So now let us learn more properties of ellipse. Now the general equation, the simplest equation of ellipse is x square by a square plus y square upon b square equals to 1. Now let's say this is x axis, this is y axis, we plot the ellipse. The ellipse cut the axis at 4 points, a comma 0 maximum x, 0 comma b maximum y, minus a comma 0 the maximum value on negative side of x, 0 comma minus b the maximum value on negative side of y. Here a is the length of semi-major axis. Major axis is the largest diameter, minor axis is the smallest diameter. As the name itself tells, semi-major axis means half of the major axis. The whole major axis has got a length 2a. The whole minor axis has got length of 2b. Semi-major axis, half of major axis is a, semi-minor axis is b. This is the easiest equation of ellipse. X square by a square plus y square by b square equals to 1. A is semi-major axis, b is semi-minor axis. Now, what are the coordinates of the 2 fixed points, the 2 focus? So, the coordinates of the 2 focus are ae comma 0 and minus ae comma 0. The 2 focus lie on the major axis. Now you might think, okay, a here is length of semi-major axis. What is e? E is called eccentricity. What is eccentricity? Eccentricity equals to under root of 1 minus b square by a square. Here b is the length of semi-major axis, a is the length of semi-minor axis. So eccentricity equals to under root of 1 minus b square by a square. The coordinate of focus are ae comma 0 and minus ae comma 0, they lie on the major axis. So now, next thing, what is area of ellipse? Area of ellipse is given by pi ab. Pi times the length of semi-major axis times the length of semi-minor axis. So if this is 4, this is 2, the area will be pi into 4 into 2. Next thing, circle is also a special type of ellipse. Just like rectangle is a special type of parallelogram, similarly circle is a special type of ellipse. Now, circle is a special type of ellipse in which the length of semi-major axis equals to the length of semi-minor axis, A equals to B. Since A equals to B, the eccentricity E comes out to be how much? E equals to under root of 1 minus B square by A square. Since A and B are equal, this quantity becomes 1. So you get under root of 1 minus 1. Under root of 1 minus 1 becomes 0. So the eccentricity for a circle comes out to be 0. Since the eccentricity comes out to be 0, what has to be the coordinate of focus? Now, coordinate of focus is AE, the length of semi-major axis times E. Since E is 0, the F2 is found at origin, F1 is found at origin. So a circle is a special type of ellipse in which the length of semi-major axis equals to length of semi-minor axis and both the foci coincides. Now, next thing here, let's say at one of the focus we have got sun and the planet moves around it. At this position, planet is closest to sun. At this position, planet is farthest away from sun. So now question is, what is the closest and farthest distance? We know that the distance of focus from origin is AE, and we know that the length of semi-major axis is A. So when the planet is farthest from sun, its distance from sun is AE plus A. When the planet is closest to sun here, what is the distance? This length is also equals to semi-major axis. So the minimum distance of planet from sun is nothing but A minus AE. So the maximum distance of planet moving in elliptical orbit from sun is A plus AE, and the minimum distance is A minus AE. So now moving on to Kepler's second law. Kepler's law says that, second law says that the radius vector from sun to a planet sweeps equal area in equal interval of time. Now what is the meaning of radius vector from planet from sun? Let's say the planet moves in elliptical orbit and sun is present at one of the focus. At some instant, let's say the planet is here, moving in its orbit, and at some instant planet is here. So this vector represents the position vector of planet with respect to sun. Now after some time the planet will move from here to here. Let's say this movement takes a time t. So the new final position vector of planet with respect to sun will be this. So this position vector sweeps some area in this time t. Now let's say after some time the planet reaches here. So this is the initial position vector. Let's say from this position after a time t the planet is here. So this is the final position vector, and in this time frame t the area swept is this much area. This is not at all intuitive. This is very difficult to predict at the time when Kepler gave it, and he gave the second law. He said that the radius vector from the sun to planet sweeps equal area in equal interval of time. So if it takes a time t for planet to go from here to here and another time t to go from here to here, then these two shaded areas have to be equal. So if I call this area A1, this area A2, A1 has to be equal to A2. Now see here, if I approximate them to triangle, here the height of triangle is more, here the height of triangle is less. So for the area to be same, here the base of triangle is less, here the base of triangle is more. So understand that the path length traveled when planet is away from sun is less, and the path length traveled when the planet is close to sun is more. You should visualize this thing in your mind. If let's say this is sun and this is the orbit of planet, as the planet comes close to sun it speeds up, as the planet goes away from sun it slows down. So it speeds up, slows down, speeds up, slows down. At which point the planet has the highest speed? The planet has the highest speed when it is closest to sun. The planet has got lowest speed when it is farthest away from sun. This closest point to sun is called perihelion. Helion comes from helios for sun. Peri means close. This point, farthest point, is called aphelion. Aphelion. Okay. For the people who know Hindi, they can remember pass wala P se, or the people who talk in English can remember the one away starts with A. Okay, so this is perihelion, this is aphelion. So now at the time when Kepler gave this proof, it was very tough. to give. But now we have a proof using the angular momentum conservation. When can we apply angular momentum conservation? When the net external torque is 0. Now when a planet revolves around the sun for any random position of planet, let's say this is the position vector of planet with respect to sun. The gravitational force by the sun on the planet is towards it. So the force applied by the sun and the position vector of planet are two anti-parallel vectors no matter where the planet is. Let's say after some time the planet comes after turning here. So the position vector, let's say r dash, and the force vector f dash. So no matter where the planet is, the position vector of planet with respect to sun and the force of gravity applied by sun on that planet will be anti-parallel vectors. Since the two vectors are anti-parallel and we know that torque equals to r cross f, if the two vectors are parallel or anti-parallel, then the torque comes out to be 0. If the torque is 0, then we can do angular momentum conservation. Remember that when the planet revolves around the sun, its angular momentum is conserved about sun, not about any random point in space. Its angular momentum is conserved about sun. So we can now prove Kepler's second law using angular momentum conservation. Let's say this is a planet. At some instant of time, let's say when the planet is at aphelion, its distance from sun is r. Let's say distance magnitude is r. And let's say at that instant the speed of planet is v. At aphelion, the angle between r and v will be 90. In an infinitely small frame of time dt, the distance traveled by this planet will be equal to v dt. And the planet will be finally here. Now, what will be this infinitely small area swept? So you can treat this infinitely small part of ellipse as a triangle. So you can say this infinitely small area swept has to be equal to half into base. The base length here, the distance traveled in a time dt will be v dt into height r. You can bring this dt down here. This quantity dA by dt becomes the rate of sweeping of area. The rate of sweeping of area comes out to be rv by 2. On the right hand side, forcefully multiply and divide by mass of planet. Multiply and divide by mass of planet, not sun, mass of planet. So you can see this quantity in numerator, mrv, is nothing but angular momentum of the planet. So you can say that dA by dt equals to L by 2m. Now since the mass of the planet remains constant, the angular momentum of planet about sun remains constant. That's why we can say the rate of sweeping of area with respect to time is constant, and that rate of sweeping of area with respect to time is nothing but angular momentum divided by 2 times the mass of planet. Using this, we can even now find out what will be the time period of a planet. We know that the planet moves in an elliptical orbit, and in the last session we have learned that the area of the whole ellipse is equals to pi ab. The rate of sweeping of area is L by 2m. We know that at what rate the planet sweeps the area, and we know the whole area. Once the planet sweeps the entire area, one cycle will be completed. So now we can say the time period can also be expressed as the total area of ellipse divided by the rate of sweeping of area. The rate of sweeping of area is L by 2m. The area of whole ellipse is pi ab. So the time period can be written as pi ab upon the rate of sweeping of area, that is L by 2 times the mass of the planet. So let's do 2 examples based on Kepler's law. Let's say this elliptical path is the orbit of a planet, and this is sun present at one of the focus. Now the A and C lie on the major axis, D and B lie on the minor axis. You have to tell it will take more time for planet to go from A to B to C, or it will take more time for planet to go from C to D to A. It will take more time for planet to go from A to B to C, or more time for planet to go from C to D to A. Definitely these two time will be equal. Why? If we look at the area swept from A to C, half of the ellipse. If we look at the area swept from C to A, half of the ellipse. Since the area swept is same, we can say the time taken to go is same. Okay. Moreover, you can say from the symmetry perspective. Second thing, it will take more time for planet to go from D to A to B, or it will take more time for planet to go from B to C to A. it will take more time for planet to go from D to A to C, or it will take more time for planet to go from B to C to D. Okay. So now your guess might be that both have to be equal. No, that is not at all right. When the planet goes from D to B, when the planet goes from D to B, the area swept is this much of area. And when the planet goes from B to D, the area swept is this much of area. So the area swept in going from B to C to D is more than the area swept on going from D to A to B. That is why this time taken will be more than the time taken to go from D to A to B. Second thing, beta, in the last slide I say that always visualize speeds up, slows down. At C minimum speed, speeds up, going from C to A, the planet speeds up, and maximum speed at A, and going from A to C, it slows down, and the minimum speed is at C. So now, next question also based on Kepler's second law. The question is, this is the elliptical orbit of a planet, this is Sun. The closest distance of the planet from the Sun is R1. When the planet is at perihelion, the distance is R1. When the planet is at aphelion, the distance is R2. So maximum distance is R2, minimum distance is R1. They are asking if the shortest distance is R1 and largest distance is R2 from the planet, find V max to V minimum. So what is the maximum speed of the planet and what is the minimum speed of the planet? We know that the speed will be maximum when R will be minimum from angular momentum conservation. So here you will have maximum speed, here you will have minimum speed. Now how to find their ratio? Beta, very simple, from angular momentum conservation. Angular momentum at this position, initial position is m V max into R1, and this is equal to the angular momentum at aphelion, that is m into V minimum into R2. You can cancel out the mass of the planet in both places. So you will get that V max by V minimum equals to R2 by R1. V max by V minimum equals to R2 by R1. Next question, what is the ratio of maximum kinetic energy of planet to minimum kinetic energy of planet? When the speed will be maximum, kinetic energy will be maximum. When the speed will be minimum, kinetic energy will be minimum. If the ratio of maximum to minimum speed is R2 to R1, then the ratio of maximum to minimum kinetic energy has to be whole square of this. Why? Kinetic energy proportional to speed square. That's why the ratio of maximum to minimum kinetic energy is R2 by R1 whole square. The third thing that gets asked, what is the ratio of maximum angular velocity to minimum angular velocity? It turns quicker here around A. So around A, angular velocity is maximum around the closest point, and here angular velocity is minimum. Now see, you can write omega max upon omega minimum equals to V max by R1, V by R, and omega minimum can be written as V minimum by this maximum distance R2. So you can write omega maximum to omega minimum as V maximum into R2 upon V minimum by R1. We know that V maximum upon V minimum is also R2 by R1. So here you can write R2 by R1 into R2 by R1. That becomes R2 square by R1 square. So now let's do Kepler's third law. The third law says that the square of the time period is proportional to the cube of semi-major axis of the elliptical path. So we can write t square proportional to a cube, where a is the length of semi-major axis. But I personally like to write the same law as t proportional to a raised to power of 3 by 2, where a is the length of semi-major axis. Now see, if a becomes double, what will happen to time period? So t proportional to a raised to power of 3 by 2. So if a becomes double, time period becomes 2 raised to power of 3 by 2 times. You can think of 2 raised to power of 3 by 2 times as 2 into 2 raised to power of half. That becomes 2 root 2. So if a becomes double, time period becomes 2 root 2 times. If a becomes triple, time period becomes 3 root 3 times. If a becomes 10 times, time period becomes 10 root 10 times. But all these data are not good. So what they will always give you? If a becomes 4 times, then time period becomes 4 root 4 times. Now that's a nice number, 4 into 2, 8. If a becomes 9 times, time period becomes 9 root 9 times. So 9 into 3, that is 27. So they will definitely give you good data. So just remember one thing. If the length of the semi-major axis I'm not saying radius, I'm not saying semi minor axis something. If the length of the semi major axis becomes n times, then the time period will become n root n times. Okay, moving on to universal law of gravitation given by Sri Isaac Newton. So let's say there are two masses m1 m2 separated by distance r. The gravitational force of attraction between these two masses m1 m2 is given by g m1 m2 by r square. Important things to remember here. Gravitational force is central force. It acts along the line joining the particles. Okay, central force. Gravitational force is conservative in nature. If a force is conservative in nature, the work done by the force in a closed loop is zero. So gravitational force is also conservative in nature. The third point, gravitational force is always attractive in nature. Electrostatic force sometimes attractive, sometimes repulsive, but gravitational force is always attractive in nature. Next, gravitational force is independent of the medium. Electrostatic force, the net electrostatic force acting between two charged particles depends upon the medium between them. But this is not the case with gravitational force. Gravitational force is independent of the medium. So now, let's do two questions on Newton's law of gravitation. First question, there are three equal masses m placed at three corners of an equilateral triangle of side length a. Question is, what is the net gravitational force on any one mass because of other two? So because of this mass, on this mass there will be a force of attraction gm square by a square. Because of this mass, on this mass there will be also a gravitational force of attraction gm square by a square. These two forces will be inclined at an angle of 60 degree. We know that if we have got two forces of equal magnitude F and F inclined at angle theta, their resultant comes out to be equal to 2F cos theta by 2. So here the force is nothing but gm square by a square, and the angle between them is 60 degree. Cos 60 by 2 gives you cos 30, and you can write cos 30 as root 3 by 2. So you get 2 gm square by a square into root 3 by 2. You can cancel out this 2 and 2. The other question is exactly brother of this question. Now this time we have got four equal masses mm placed at four corners of a square. What is the net gravitational force on one of the mass? So on this mass, because of this mass, the gravitational force of attraction will be gm square by a square. Because of this mass will be towards it gm square by a square. But the distance from this third mass is not at all a, it is root 2a. So because of this third mass, there will be a force of attraction gm square by root 2a whole square. So now think that three forces are acting. Let's say gm square by a square this way, gm square by a square this way, and one force because of this diagonally opposite one, that is gm square by 2a square. The resultant of these two forces, gm square by a square, gm square by a square, comes out to be root 2 gm square by a square. Also, there is one force of gm square by 2a square because of the diagonal one. So the net force comes out to be equal to gm square by a square into root 2 plus half. Now, one more question get asked, which is the elder brother of this question. If we have got three identical masses placed at three corners of equilateral triangle, but they are not falling towards each other because they are moving in a circle. So what has to be the speed? So we know that the net force acting towards the center has to be equal to centripetal force. If they form an equilateral triangle of side length a, then the distance of one of the mass from the center will be a by root 3. This will be the distance for equilateral triangle. The net force acting towards the center has to be equal to centripetal force. So I can write root 3 gm square by a square has to be equals to mv square by r, and each mass revolves in a circle of radius a by root 3. So the root 3 goes up, cancel out root 3, a and a. So v comes out to be under root of gm by a. So now let's do a question. There is a rod of mass m having length l, and there is a point mass m placed at distance a from one of the end of rod. What is the force of gravity between these two masses? So now many a time I find students using here the concept of center of mass, and that is the only purpose of taking up this question. Students say that, sir, see, for this rod the center of mass will be here, the distance will be l by 2. So the effective separation between two masses is a plus l by 2. So the force has to be equal to g m upon L by 2 plus A whole square. This is not at all answer. So the only purpose of taking up this example is that do not apply the concept of center of mass here. Then sir, what to do? Divide this rod into infinite number of infinitely small pieces. Go at random distance x from the point mass, and on the rod think of an infinitely small element of a thickness dx. The infinitely small mass of this infinitely thin element will be m into dx by L. The gravitational force of attraction between this infinitely small element and that point mass separated by distance x will be equal to, the infinitely small force will be g into m into dm upon separation between them whole square. Now, in place of dm, substitute m dx by L. So you get df equals to gm m dx by L x square. You can write this 1 upon x square dx as x raised to the power of minus 2 dx. So you get df equals to gmm by L into x raised to the power of minus 2 dx. Integrate both the side. On the left hand side, force from 0 to f, and on the right hand side, x from where the rod start at A and where the rod end at A plus L, from A to A plus L. So after integration, you will get gmm by L, that is constant outside. Integration of x raised to the power of minus 2 dx gives you x raised to the power of minus 1 by minus 1. Substituting upper limit and lower limit, you get force equals to minus gmm by L into upper limit A plus L minus lower limit A. So 1 upon A plus L minus 1 upon A. So you can solve it at minus gmm by L into A minus A plus L by A into A plus L. Now you can see here A and A will get cancelled and this L and L will get cancelled. So the overall answer comes out to be, the net force comes out to be gmm by A into A plus L. Why I took this particular example? The only purpose of taking up this question is that don't assume that you can apply the concept of center of mass here. You can't assume the entire mass of the rod to be placed at its center of mass. That is the learning from this question. Next example. There is earth, there is moon. The separation between, let's say, earth and moon is d. It is given that if the mass of moon is m, then the mass of earth is 81 times the mass of moon. Question is, where should a mass be placed between them so that the net gravitational force on the mass is 0? They haven't mentioned how much mass we are going to place, but still they have asked this question. So let's say we place some mass m dash at distance x. If the distance from earth is x, then the distance from moon has to be d minus x. If the net gravitational force on this mass is 0, then the gravitational force of earth has to be same as the gravitational force of moon. The gravitational force due to earth will be g into mass of earth 81m into m dash upon separation whole square x square. The gravitational force of moon will be g into mass of moon into mass of this particle m dash upon separation between them d minus x whole square. You can cancel out g m dash g m dash. Taking under root both the side, you get 9 by x equals to 1 upon d minus x. Bring this to left hand side, right hand side. So you get 9d minus 9x equals to x, or 9d equals to 10x, or x equals to 9d by 10. So notice that the point at which the mass experiences net force 0, that is closer to moon and away from earth. The distance from moon, earth, comes out to be 9d by 10. So the distance from moon comes out to be d by 10, 1/9 the distance. So if the ratio of mass is 81:1, the ratio of distance for null point or the point where the gravitational field is 0 is 9:1. So now, since the gravitational force is a force, now we will learn how to write gravitational force in vector form. Let's say there are two masses m1 and m2 and we wish to write F21. What is the meaning of F21? The force on mass 2 because of mass 1. The force on mass 2 due to mass 1 will be opposite to the position vector of 2 with respect to 1. Why? Because the force has to be attractive in nature. So this will be the direction of force on 2 due to 1. the magnitude of this force will be equal to G m1 m2 upon magnitude of this separation whole square, and the direction of this force has to be opposite to the position vector. So we have multiplied a unit vector, a vector of magnitude 1 in direction opposite to position vector. Okay, so this is r21, position vector of 2 with respect to 1, minus opposite vector and cap a unit vector. So this gives the magnitude, this gives the direction. So this is the force in vector form. Now see, r21 cap is a unit vector in direction of position vector of 2 with respect to 1. A unit vector is nothing but a vector divided by its own magnitude. So in place of r21 cap, taking the minus outside, in place of r21 cap we can write r21 upon magnitude of r21. So here, taking out the minus, in denominator we have got position vector of 2 with respect to 1, magnitude whole cube into position vector of 2 with respect to 1. Position vector of 2 with respect to 1 is nothing but position vector of 2 minus position vector of 1. Next thing, the next heading we will do is gravitational field. Gravitational field, the symbol I like to use is I. I like to keep it different from electric field, there I use E. Now gravitational field at a point, how do I find gravitational field at any point? To determine the gravitational field at any point, place a test mass at that point. The force acting on the test mass per unit test mass is defined the field at that point. So now gravitational field is defined as the force acting on the test mass per unit test mass. Now how to write the gravitational field because of a mass m at distance r? Procedure is simple. Place a test mass here, let's call it mt. The force acting on this test mass will be G m mt by r square. This is the force. So the field has to be the force acting on the test mass divided by test mass. That comes out to be G m by r square. Notice that the force is attractive in nature. Okay, that's why the force acting on this test mass will be towards this other mass, capital A. The gravitational force and gravitational field are always parallel vector because mass can never be negative. So first point we should know about gravitational field. Gravitational field due to a mass is towards the mass. A positive charge produces electric field away from it. A negative charge produces electric field towards it. While in case of gravitational field, a mass always produces gravitational field towards itself. It never produces gravitational field away from it. Second thing, gravitational field of Earth near the surface of Earth is G. Gravitational field of Earth and acceleration due to gravity are synonyms. Why? If I place the marker here and I ask you, beta, what is the gravitational field at the position of marker? You will say, sir, very simple. Place a mass. Look at the force acting on this mass. The force acting on the mass per unit test mass will be the field. If the marker has a mass m, then the force acting on the marker is mg. And the force acting on the marker per unit mass of marker is mg by m, that is g. So remember that the gravitational field due to Earth and acceleration due to gravity are synonyms. So now field due to some standard bodies. First we will do field due to a ring mass. Let's say we have a ring having mass m, radius r, and we wish to write the field on its axis. The formula for this field is given as gmx upon r square plus x square raised to power of 3 by 2. You have to mug up this formula. Now, what is the field at the center of a ring? If I substitute x equals to 0, I can say that the field becomes 0. So field at the center of a ring having uniform mass distribution m is 0. What will be the field at infinity? At infinite distance, the field will be way weak. So even at infinity, the field is 0. So field at center is 0, field at infinity is 0. So as I move on the axis of the ring, the magnitude of field first increases then decreases. The field due to a ring on its axis is maximum, field is maximum at x equals to r by root 2. So remember this, the field due to a ring on its axis is given as gmx by r square plus x square raised to power of 3 by 2. Now if we plot the graph of field versus distance on the axis, the graph goes something like this. the magnitude of field is maximum at distance r by root 2 from its center. Somebody might ask why you have plotted graph on the negative axis. Understand that at any point on the axis, the field because of a mass is towards the mass. So as the x increases, the field is in negative x direction. That's why this is the appropriate way to draw it. Next, what is the field due to a shell? Shell means having a mass only on the surface. There is no mass inside. Now, let's say we have a shell of mass m having radius r and there is nothing inside. Since there is nothing inside, remember that the field inside a shell due to shell is 0. So if you go at some random point inside the shell at distance r from the center, for distance from the center less than the radius, the field comes out to be 0. The field inside a shell because of shell is 0. For outside point, let's say we think of some other point whose distance from the center is more than the radius. Then for outside point, one can assume the entire mass of shell to be placed at its center. The field because of a point mass at distance r is given by gm by r square. So here also, if you assume the entire mass of shell to be placed at center, the field at a point at distance r outside is given by gm by r square. If we plot the graph of field due to shell, the field inside the shell due to shell is 0. So when r increases from 0 to up to the radius, the field inside is 0. Okay. For outside point, as the value of r increases, you can see the field keeps on decreasing. So the field inside the shell because of shell is 0. For outside point, you can assume the entire mass of shell to be placed at center. The field is simply gm by r square and the graph goes like this. Again, I have plotted the gravitational field intensity on the negative. Why? Because at this point, the field because of this mass will be towards it, not away from it. Now, the field due to a solid sphere having a uniform mass density distributed over it. Now here we have a solid sphere having mass m and radius r. This is the most important case because this is the case of Earth. So I will write here, remember that this is also the case of Earth that we derive. Actually not, because Earth has got denser core and the density of Earth decreases as we move from core towards the surface. But for physics purpose, in our syllabus, we take Earth as a sphere, solid sphere of uniform mass distribution. Now let's say we have a uniform solid sphere having mass m and radius r. For a point inside now, at distance r, the field is not at all 0. As a matter of fact, as we go from center to surface, the field continuously increases. The gravitational field at any distance r for r less than the radius is given by gm upon r square, that is the value on the surface, into small r by capital R. Or we can remember it as gm into distance from the center upon radius of the sphere whole cube. For outside point, it is still good. For outside point, we can still assume the entire mass to be placed at the center. So field for outside point comes out to be gm by r square. If we plot the graph, as we go from center to surface, the field linearly increases. Inside the solid sphere, the field is proportional to r, and outside it, the field is proportional to 1 by r square. Now, question is, let's say we have got this solid sphere, and on the surface of solid sphere, if the gravitational field intensity is I, let's say this solid sphere has got radius r, then what is the gravitational field intensity at distance r by 2 from its center? R by 2. So beta, on going from center to surface, the gravitational field intensity increases linearly. So at half the distance from center, the field has to be half I by 2. What will be the field at distance r by 3? I by 3. At distance r by 10, I by 10. So easy. So as you go from center to surface, the field increases linearly with the distance. As for outside point, what if you are at distance 2r? For outside point, remember that field is inversely proportional to the distance from center whole square. So if you go at double the distance from center outside, then the field becomes 1/4. If you go at triple the distance outside, the field becomes 1/9. Okay, so remember this. This is important case. This is the case of Earth. So the next heading, that is acceleration due to gravity. Let's say this is Earth having mass m, radius r, and a particle of mass small m is placed on the surface of Earth. The Earth will apply a force on this mass, gravitational force, given by universal gravitational force is gmm by r square. And we know from everyday life, the force on a mass m placed on the surface of Earth is mg. So gmm by r square equals to mg. Cancelling out m and m, we get that the acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth is gm by r square. Now you will say this is same as the formula of the gravitational field intensity on the surface of a solid sphere. So yeah, they are one and the same thing. Sometimes we don't wish to write the acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth in terms of mass of Earth. We wish to write it in terms of density of Earth. Then what to do? In place of mass of Earth, think that this is a sphere having density rho and radius r. In place of mass, you can write density into volume 4/3 pi r cube. R square r cube, two terms get cancelled. So you can even write the acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth is 4/3 pi rho g r. One thing, this formula is valid for any planet. So I am making a small change here. I will say acceleration due to gravity on the surface of any planet equals to g times mass of the planet upon radius of the planet whole square. Similarly, acceleration due to gravity on the surface of any planet equals to 4/3 pi density of the planet into g, that is a constant for everything, times the radius of the planet. Now, next thing we are going to learn variation of g with height. As a particle goes above the surface of Earth, its height increases, and so is its distance from the center of Earth. Since the distance from the center of Earth increases, the force on the mass decreases. Since the force on the mass decreases, we can say that the acceleration due to gravity decreases with height. Acceleration due to gravity decreases as we move above the surface of Earth. So, what will be the force on a small mass m placed at height h above the surface of Earth? The distance from the center of Earth will be r plus h. For outside point, I can assume the entire mass of Earth to be placed at center. So the force can be written as g into mass of Earth into mass of this particle upon distance from the center whole square, r plus h whole square. And this can be written as mass of the particle into acceleration due to gravity at height h. Cancel out m and m. So you get acceleration due to gravity at height h equals to g times mass of Earth upon radius of Earth plus height above the surface of Earth whole square. If forcefully you take r square common from the denominator, you get acceleration due to gravity at height h equals to gm by r square into 1 plus h by r whole square. This quantity gm by r square can be written as acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth. So we get that acceleration due to gravity at a height h above the surface of Earth is equals to acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth upon 1 plus h by r whole square. But in everyday life, the height that we go above the surface of Earth is very less compared to the radius of Earth. So for the height above the surface of Earth less than the radius, we can say that if height is less than radius, then h by r will be a quantity less than 1. We can write this same expression g upon 1 plus h by r whole square as g times 1 plus h by r raised to power of -2. This 2 in denominator goes into numerator and becomes -2. Using binomial approximation, for h by r less than 1, we can bring this power in front and we can write the acceleration due to gravity at a height h equals to acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth into 1 minus 2h by r. Now kids, furthermore, we can use acceleration due to gravity, multiply this g. Now, bring this acceleration due to gravity at height h on right and this quantity on left. This quantity g minus gh is nothing but the difference in the acceleration due to gravity on the surface and on height h. We can write this as delta g, the change in acceleration due to gravity. So we can write 2gh by r equals to delta g, or the change in acceleration due to gravity upon the acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth equals to 2h by r. So the fractional change in acceleration due to gravity equals to 2 times the height above the surface of Earth upon radius. Now here I am placing star mark on these two. These two can be used when the height is less than the radius of earth, is very small compared to the radius of earth. This thing works everywhere. You ask students, what is the acceleration due to gravity at a height equals to r? The idiots start using this. You can't use this. This is valid when the height is very less compared to the radius of earth. So for large heights, you have to remember this and you have to use this. So we have done variation of g with height. Now we will do variation of g with depth. So let's say this is earth and we go into a tunnel at depth d below the surface of earth. What will be the force acting on a mass m placed at depth d below the surface of earth? So now here, the gravitational field intensity at distance small r from the center is given as gmr by r cube. If you place a mass m here, the force acting has to be field into mass. If you go at depth d and distance from the center of the earth is r, you can say very well that distance from the center is nothing but radius of earth minus the depth d that you have gone inside. So now here, gmr by r cube into m, this is the force, and this can also be written as mass of the particle times acceleration due to gravity at depth d. You can cancel out m with m and get acceleration due to gravity at depth d equals to gm by r square into r minus t. Write this r cube as r square into r. Why? Because this quantity right here, gm by r square, becomes acceleration due to gravity on the surface of earth. So you can write acceleration due to gravity at depth d equals to 1 minus acceleration due to gravity on the surface of earth into 1 minus d by r. Now I will do the same thing as I did last time. Multiply this g, so you get acceleration due to gravity at depth d equals to g minus g into d by r. Bring this gd to right hand side, that becomes delta g. So delta g by g comes out to be this times d by r. In last time, in variation with height, we got the fractional change in gravity equals to 2h by r. This time we got the fractional change in gravity equals to d by r. Notice that for same height gone above and below, the fractional change in gravity on moving above the surface of earth is double the fractional change in gravity in moving below the surface of earth. As a matter of fact, no matter whether you go above the surface of earth or below the surface of earth, the acceleration due to gravity decreases. If we plot a graph of acceleration due to gravity versus distance from the center of earth, going from center of earth till surface, the acceleration due to gravity increases, and after that it decreases. One more thing, what will, if the acceleration due to gravity on the surface of earth is g, what will be the acceleration due to gravity at distance r by 2 from the center of earth? G by 2. R by 3? G by 3. I'm not saying at depth r by 3. No. I'm saying if the tunnel is so deep that the distance of the particle from the center of earth is r by 3, then there the acceleration due to gravity will be g by 3. So this thing done. Next thing, variation of g due to rotation. Okay, so we know that earth rotates. Because of that, in the frame of earth, a centrifugal force acts on particle radially outward. Because of that, the effective value of g at any latitude lambda is not equal to g, it changes. So the g effective at any latitude lambda equals to acceleration due to gravity when the earth do not rotate minus angular velocity with which the earth rotates whole square into radius of earth into cos square lambda. So g effective equals to g minus omega square r cos square lambda. For equator, somewhere here, for equator the latitude lambda is 0. Since lambda is 0, cos square 0 is 1. So for equator you get g effective equals to g minus omega square r. This gets asked many a time in competitive examination. What should be the omega so that the effective acceleration due to gravity on the surface becomes 0? So for this quantity to become 0, you write g minus omega square r equals to 0, or omega square r equals to g, or omega equals to under root of g by r. Next thing, at pole, lambda becomes 90. Since lambda becomes 90, cos square 90 becomes 0. So at pole, the acceleration due to gravity is g. So notice that acceleration due to gravity at equator comes out to be less than the acceleration due to gravity at pole. So as we move from equator to pole, the acceleration due to gravity decreases. Okay, so now let's do gravitational potential energy. if we have got two masses m1 and m2 separated by distance r, the gravitational potential energy is defined as minus g m1 m2 by r. When the separation between particles is infinite, as a convention we have defined that the gravitational potential energy is 0. Moreover, two masses always attract each other. Gravitational potential energy as a convention is always defined as negative. There is an inbuilt minus sign in the formula. Masses can never be negative. G is not a negative constant and R represents the separation between the two masses. So, gravitational potential energy as a convention is negative. So, for two masses m1 m2 separated by distance r, gravitational potential energy is given as minus g m1 m2 by r. But what if in a system we have got more than two masses? Let's say in a system we have got three masses m1 m2 m3, such that the separation between m1 m2 is x, separation between m2 m3 is y, and separation between m1 m3 is z. Then we write the gravitational potential energy of system as minus g m1 m2 by x minus g m2 m3 by y minus g m3 m1 by z. I have wrote gravitational potential energy for each pair here. So, a question for practice. Let's say you have got four equal masses m at four corners of a square. Question is, what is the gravitational potential energy of this system? For four masses, you will get in totality 6 pairs. First, second, third, fourth, and 2 pairs along the two diagonals. So, because of these 4 pairs, you will write gravitational potential energy as minus gmm by a, minus gmm by a, minus gmm by a, minus gmm by a. And because of these two masses, minus gmm by root 2a, minus gmm by root 2a. So, overall we get minus 4 times gmm by a and 2 times gmm by root 2a. Okay. So, 4 pairs of distance a and 2 pairs of distance root 2a. Next thing, what is gravitational potential? Remember how we first defined a force and then we defined the field. In the same way, we first defined gravitational potential energy and then we defined potential of a point. Just like gravitational potential energy is a scalar quantity, gravitational potential is also a scalar quantity. Just like force is a vector quantity, gravitational field is also a vector quantity. So, how do we define the potential of a point? The potential of a point is defined as the change in potential energy in bringing a test mass from infinity to that point per unit test mass. Once more, the gravitational potential of a point is defined as the change in potential energy in bringing a test mass from infinity to that point per unit test mass. So, gravitational potential at a point is defined as change in potential energy in bringing a test mass from infinity to that point upon the test mass. So, let's say somebody asks me, what is the gravitational potential because of a mass m at distance r from it? So, if we wish to find the gravitational potential because of a mass m at distance r from it, bring a test mass from infinity to this point. When you bring the test mass from infinity to this point, the change in potential energy, we will define the potential of this point as the change in potential energy. Initially, when the separation is infinity, potential energy is 0. Finally, when the separation is r, potential energy is minus g, this mass, into the test mass upon r. The potential of this point is defined as the change in potential energy per unit test mass. So, now you have to divide it with test mass. So, this test mass get cancelled. So, the gravitational potential because of a mass m at distance r is given as minus g m by r. Remember this, gravitational potential because of a mass m at distance r is minus g m by r. So, now the next heading, relationship between field and potential. I am not saying force and potential energy, field and potential. From our study of work power energy, we know that the conservative force acting in x direction is minus del u by del x. Similarly, the conservative force acting in y direction is given by minus del u by del y, and the conservative force acting in z direction is minus del u by del z. Now, here in place of force, conservative, in this case gravitational acting, can be written as the test mass times the field, and the infinitely small change in potential energy can be written as infinitely small change in the test mass into the potential. Since test mass is a constant, you can take it out and cancel it out. So we get that the field in x direction is minus del v by del x, the field in y direction is minus del v by del y, and the field in z direction is minus del v by del z. But what is this del? Proper differentiation is much tougher than partial differentiation. Partial differentiation is a very easy thing to do. So how to do it? Let's understand it using a question. Question is, in a region of space, the potential is given as 2x square y plus 2xz plus xyz. You need to find the field in x direction, y direction and z direction at any coordinate. Now, the field in x direction, solution, the field in x direction is given by minus del v by del x. When we partial differentiate a function with respect to x, then we treat all the variables apart from x as a constant. So when I will differentiate this function with respect to x, apart from x, I will treat everything else as constant. It means that I will treat y and z as constant. So now, if I differentiate this first term minus, let's find out del v by del x. If I differentiate this first term, here we have got 2x square y. Apart from x, I have to treat everything else as constant. So I will treat 2 and y as constant, take them out of the differentiation. The differentiation of x square gives you 2x. Similarly, the second term 2zx. Apart from x, I will treat everything as a constant. So this 2 and z are constant. Take them out of the differentiation. The differentiation of x gives you 1. No need to write it. 2z into 1 is 2z. The third term x, y, z. Apart from x, I will treat everything else as constant. Since y and z are constant, being treated as constant, take them outside. And the differentiation of x is 1. So no need to write it. It is simply yz. Now let's see what is the field in y direction. Similarly, we write the field in y direction as minus del v by del y. This time we are differentiating with respect to y. Since we are differentiating with respect to y, apart from y, I will treat all the other variables as constant. So this time x and z will be treated like constant. So minus del v by del y equals to minus. In the first term, you have got 2x square. Treat 2 as well as x square as constant. Take them outside. The differentiation of y is 1. No need to write it. 2x square into 1 is 2x square. In the second term, you don't have y. Since you don't have y, 2zx, all three are constant. The differentiation of a constant is 0. In this third term, apart from y, you will treat x and z as constant. So take the constant outside, x and z, and the differentiation of y gives you 1. Similarly, the field in z direction equals to minus del v by del z. So minus times. This time you have to differentiate everything with respect to z. When you differentiate everything with respect to z, in the first term, you don't find z. And apart from z, everything else is constant. So the whole term acts like a constant and its differentiation is 0. In the second term, you get 2zx. Apart from z, 2 and x both will be treated as constant. Take them outside. And the differentiation of z is 1. So no need to write it. 2x into 1 is as good as 2x. The third one, x, y, z. Here, you will treat x and y as constant. Take them outside. The differentiation of z is 1. No need to write it. This is your field in z direction. So now we will learn potential due to different type of things. First, ring. How to write potential due to ring? Let's say a ring has mass m, radius r, and we wish to write potential on the axis of the ring at distance x from the center. The potential on the axis of ring at distance x from the center is given by minus gm by under root of r square plus x square. Field is a scalar quantity. Potential is a vector quantity. Since each particle of ring is at distance r, under root of r square plus x square from this point, we get the potential simply as minus gm upon under root of r square plus x square. One important thing, what is the potential at center of the ring? So for center of the ring, substitute x equals to 0. When you substitute here x equals to 0, you get potential at the center of ring to be as minus gm by r. As we move on the axis of ring, the strength of field first increases and decreases and is maximum at distance r by root 2. But potential keeps on continuously decreasing. So when we draw the potential versus distance on the axis graph, the potential at center is minus gm by r, and as the value of x keeps on increasing, the potential on the line keeps on decreasing in magnitude. Next thing, if we have a shell, how do we write potential? For shell, we have got two types of cases. For distance from the center less than radius and distance from the center greater than radius. The field inside the shell because of shell is 0, and the potential at every point inside the shell is constant. The field inside the shell because of shell is 0, and the potential inside the shell is constant, equals to the value on its surface. The value of potential on the surface of a shell is minus gm by r. So everywhere inside the shell, the potential is equals to minus gm by r, everywhere inside. For outside point, again you can assume the entire mass to be at center. The potential because of a mass m at distance r is minus gm by r, so simply minus gm by r. If we draw the graph of potential versus distance from the center, from center till surface, potential is constant everywhere minus gm by r. The potential at every point inside the shell because of it is constant, the field is 0. And on moving outside, the potential keeps on decreasing with the distance. As for a solid sphere, the formula inside looks way ugly, but you need to remember it, because if it comes, you won't be able to derive it at any cost. So better to mug it up. Okay, so now here, as we go from center of the solid sphere to its surface, the potential varies with distance from the center as v equals to minus gm by 2r cube into 3r square minus r square. Mug it up right now. Okay, minus gm upon 2r cube into 3r square minus r square. For outside points, it's still good. For outside point, again you can assume the entire mass to be present at center and simply minus gm by r. If we plot the graph of potential versus distance from the center for a solid sphere, as the distance increases, potential's magnitude first decreases and then further decreases. If I substitute r equals to 0, this means that the distance from center is 0, that is at the center. Here you get this quantity becomes 0, so minus gm into 3r square upon 2r cube, that becomes minus 3 by 2 gm by r. So remember that potential at the center of a solid sphere is 1.5 times the potential on its surface. On surface, potential is minus gm by capital R. At center, minus 3 by 2 gm by r. The potential at center is 1.5 times than on its surface. The potential going first decreases and then further decreases in the magnitude. So let's do two simple examples. First example, we have a shell of radius r having mass capital M, and at the center of shell we have placed a mass small m. We need to find field and potential at point x and y, which are inside and outside the shell. The point x is at distance small r from center, where a mass small m is placed, and the point y is at distance r dash outside, where r dash is the distance from center. First, how to write potential at point x? At point x, there will be potential because of both this mass as well as mass of the shell. Because of this mass, at point x, potential will be minus g into small m by r, distance r. And the potential inside the shell because of shell is same as that on its surface. So here at point x, because of shell, potential will be minus g into m upon capital R. Now what will be the field at point x? So field at point x. The field at point x because of shell is 0. The field inside the shell because of shell is 0. So at point x you will find field only because of the mass placed at center. So the field at point x will be simply equals to magnitude wise towards the center, g m by r square, and there will be no field at point x because of shell. Now let's talk about point y. At point y, because of this mass m placed at center, the potential will be minus g into small m by y. Because of the whole shell, this y is at distance outside, so you can assume the whole mass of shell to be at center. So because of shell you get minus gm by y. How to write the field at point y? At point y, the field because of this point mass will be towards it equals to gm by y square. And for shell also you can assume the entire mass to be at center. You simply get plus gm by y square towards the center. Next example. There are two identical masses m and m placed at distance t. P is their central point. We need to write the potential at P and we need to write the field at P. So first of all, let's start writing with the potential at P. If P is the midpoint, then the distance of P from each mass will be d by 2. So the potential at P because of first mass will be minus gm upon d by 2. The potential at P because of second mass will also be minus gm upon d by 2. So this becomes minus 2 gm by d minus 2 gm by d, that becomes minus 4 gm by d. Now what about field? Field is a vector quantity. The field produced by this mass will be towards itself. The field produced by that mass will be towards itself. And these two fields will have equal magnitude in opposite direction. So they will cancel out each other and the net field at point P comes out to be 0. So now let's do two questions to understand mechanical energy conservation. The first question, this is Earth of mass m and a small mass m is released from a height 2r above the surface of Earth. Question is, find the speed with which this mass will hit the surface of Earth. You have to find the speed with which this mass hits the surface of Earth. So this is a classical question of mechanical energy conservation. All you have to do is kinetic energy here plus potential energy here equals to kinetic energy final plus potential energy final. Right now this mass is at rest, Earth is at rest, so there is no kinetic energy. Let's say just before hitting the surface of Earth, this mass attains a speed v. We can say kinetic energy initial plus potential energy initial equals to kinetic energy final plus potential energy final. Kinetic energy initial shunya because none of them have any speed. Potential energy initial will be minus gmm by 3r. Why 3r? Because the distance from the center of Earth will be radius of Earth and it has been released from from such a height which is equals to 2 times the radius of Earth. So initial kinetic energy plus initial potential energy equals to final kinetic energy. Just before hitting the surface of Earth, this particle will have kinetic energy half mv square and the potential energy will be minus gmm by r. Now you can cancel out small m from each term. You can bring this term to the left hand side. So you get gmm by r minus gmm by 3r. That becomes 2 gm by 3r equals to half mv square. So m has been cancelled. So here you get v equals to under root of 4g m by 3r. But many a times you won't find this answer. Why? They will now forcefully multiply an r in numerator and denominator and write this quantity g m by r square as acceleration due to gravity on the surface of Earth. So you might find the answer to be given as under root of 4 by 3 gr. Next example, two unequal masses m and 4m are released when they are at separation d. They will attract each other because of gravity. Now question is, find the speed of 4m when separation becomes d by 4. When separation becomes 1/4, what will be the speed of 4m? So let's say when the separation becomes 4d by 4, the speed of 4m is v. Now you have to think here, if the speed of 4m is v, what has to be the speed of m? How do I know? From momentum conservation. There is no external force acting on the system of these two particles. So the net momentum of the system has to be 0. Since this mass 4m attains a speed v towards left, this mass m must attain a speed 4v towards right. So when we add up their momentum, 4mv towards right, 4mv towards left becomes 0. Now simply do initial kinetic energy plus initial potential energy equals to final kinetic energy plus final potential energy. Initial kinetic energy 0, initial potential energy minus gm into 4m by d equals to final kinetic energy half m into 4v whole square. Because of this mass, half into 4m into v square. This is the final kinetic energy plus final potential energy minus gm into 4m upon d by 4. Solving this equation, you can find out the value of v. So now it's time to talk about satellites. Let's say this is Earth of mass m and a satellite of mass small m revolves around it with a speed v in a circle of radius r. We know that the net force acting towards the center must be equal to centripetal force. So the force of gravity acting towards the center provides the required centripetal force. So gmm by r square equals to mv square by r. If we cancel out m and one term of r and r, we get v equals to under root of gm by r. Notice that the speed with which the satellite orbits do not depend upon the mass of satellite. So whether there is a heavier satellite orbiting in radius r or a lighter satellite orbiting in radius r, they must have the same speed. It depends upon the mass of Earth, but it does not depend upon the mass of satellite. Next thing, how to find the time period? Time period is nothing but 2 pi r divided by speed. Speed is under root of gm by r. So time period is 2 pi r by v. In place of v, write gm by r. This root r goes in the numerator and gives us r raised to power of 3 by 2. Notice that time period is again proportional to r raised to power of 3 by 2, which is nothing but Kepler's third law. T square proportional to r cube, so T proportional to r raised to power of 3 by 2. What is the kinetic energy of this satellite? We know that kinetic energy has to be half mv square. How to get it? See here, kids. We write gmm by r square equals to mv square by r. Now, if we cancel out, we know that gmm by r square equals to mv square by r. Cancel out 1 r with 1 r. So you get mv square equals to gmm by r, but we don't want mv square, we want half mv square, so multiply both the side by 2. So the kinetic energy comes out to be gmm by 2r. Kinetic energy of a satellite comes out to be gmm by 2r. What has to be the potential energy? We know that when there are two masses m1, m2 separated by distance r, potential energy is minus gmm by r. So minus gmm by r. Notice that potential energy has double the magnitude of kinetic energy, but with a minus sign. Now what will be the total energy? The sum of kinetic energy plus potential energy. Potential energy is minus gmm by r. Kinetic energy is gmm by 2r. When you add them up, total energy comes out to be minus gmm by 2r. Okay. So we can remember this stuff. Now the world famous correlation between kinetic energy, potential energy, total energy. Kinetic energy equals to minus times total energy, right? And kinetic energy has half the magnitude of potential energy, but of opposite sign. So we write kinetic energy equals to minus times total energy equals to minus of potential energy by 2. For a satellite orbiting, the total energy is negative, potential energy is negative. So minus of total energy and minus of potential energy by 2. First thing, there are some satellites called geostationary satellite. Geostationary satellite rotates with the same angular velocity as that of Earth, so that they appear to be at the same point above the Earth. The radius of the height of the geostationary satellite is approximately 6 times the radius of Earth. Second, satellite is nothing but a freely falling body, and this is an important article. People think that in satellite there is no gravity. Inside the satellite, G effective is 0. If you have a lift that is freely falling, what do you write G effective? You write G effective as G minus G, that is 0. Satellite is again case of a freely falling body. Think that this is Earth, and from some height you release a particle. What happens? It falls straight down. But if you give it some horizontal velocity, it will go forward and then fall. If you give it more velocity, it will go forward and then fall. If you give it sufficient velocity, then it will be continuously falling, but the separation between Earth and that satellite will never be decreasing. So a satellite is nothing but a case of a freely falling body. Question is, if there is an astronaut inside the satellite, do Earth apply force on that astronaut? The answer is yes, it applies. If the Earth won't apply the force on astronaut, why will the astronaut revolve around the Earth? The Earth applies a force. But the G effective, the apparent value of G observed by this astronaut is 0, because it's a case of free fall. So remember that satellite is nothing but a freely falling body. So the last heading, escape velocity. I like to explain the escape velocity taking an example. So let's start with an example. This is Earth of mass m, and there is a small particle of mass m on the surface of Earth. Question is, find the value of velocity that should be given to the particle so that the particle goes up to a height, case 1 equal to r, case 2 equals to infinity. We can use here the same phenomena, mechanical energy conservation. If this particle goes up to a height r and then stops. Okay. Then we can say for solution of part 1, we will say initial kinetic energy half mv square plus initial potential energy minus gmm by r equals to final kinetic energy, and after reaching a height r above the surface of earth, its kinetic energy is 0, plus final potential energy minus gmm by distance from the center of earth becomes 2r, so 2r. So now here you can take this term to the right hand side, so you get half mv square equals to minus gmm by 2r plus gmm by r, that becomes gmm by 2r. You can cancel out 2 m, you get the speed has to be equals to under root of gm by r. Now question is, with how much speed it should be projected so that the height becomes infinite. So let's do this second part. If we want the height to become infinite, it means that the particle escapes the gravitational influence of earth. Again we will do the same thing, initial kinetic energy half mv square plus initial potential energy minus gmm by r equals to final kinetic energy. After reaching height infinity, the kinetic energy should become 0 plus final potential energy. When the separation becomes infinite, the potential energy also have to be 0. So from here we get half mv square equals to gmm by r. Cancelling out m and m, the speed has to be equals to under root of 2 gm by r. And this is called the escape velocity. This is the minimum velocity that should be given to a particle from the surface of earth so that it escapes the gravitational field of earth, given that we neglect any drag force being applied by the atmosphere. Similarly, if we wish to shoot a particle at a distance r from center of earth such that it escapes, then you get under root of gm 2 gm by small r. Some fun facts about escape velocity. First, earth has atmosphere, but moon do not have atmosphere. Why moon does not have atmosphere? Because due to thermal agitation, the velocity attained by the gas molecules is more than the escape velocity for moon. Moon has got lesser mass than earth, so it requires a lesser velocity to escape moon, and the gaseous molecules have escaped moon because they had that much of velocity. That's why there is no atmosphere on moon. Second, a black hole is a place from where nothing comes out. Even light can't escape. So the escape velocity for black hole is even more than the speed of light. The black holes are so goddamn massive. They have got so much of mass that their escape velocity even go above the speed of light. So under root of 2 times g into mass of black hole upon radius of black hole, it is greater than 3 into 10 raised to the power of 8. That is the speed of light. Next thing, let's say this is earth and there is a particle of mass m at distance r from the center of earth. If the particle performs circular motion, in the last heading we have learned the speed has to be under root of gm by r. If the particle has to escape, then the speed has to be root 2 gm by r. This means that the escape velocity from same distance above the surface, above the center of earth, from distance, measuring distance from the center of earth, the escape velocity is root 2 times the circular motion velocity at that distance from the surface of earth. So that's all. Keep studying. Bye bye.